Similarly, I'd like to acknowledge the incredible lands that we work on across the Northern Territory. So I'm up here in Darwin on Larrakia country, and it's a great privilege to work and play and learn on these lands. And I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners and elders past and present. My team is spread all across the territory actually, and also one down in Sydney too. So we have researchers in Darwin, in Nhulunbuy, in Tennant Creek, and Alice Springs as well. Catherine's the main town we don't have covered, but we try and do work that sort of captures all across the territory. So wherever you're from, we want to hear from you. We do work in that area, and we'd love to have the chance to kind of share it with you too. Um, so some of this is a bit mystical until you get a bit of insight into it. When I started out in my job, I went to a couple of conferences and I just had no idea how this presentations, you just go in and you soak it up. You don't necessarily know how that's actually structured or how that was put together or whose work gets showcased or how does that actually work? So I'm going to just talk a little bit about this to give you the insider info. I've been involved in organising conferences that are national alcohol and drug conferences. I've presented at places like Ardent as well. I've been involved in public health conferences, but there's a few things that are sort of constant across different conferences. So there's usually some kind of a committee that helps to decide these sort of big speakers that we call keynotes or invited presentations. So the conference committee kind of decides, hey, there's a couple of things that we want to focus on this year. What have we heard from our members that they'd like to hear about? What did people say last year that they think would be important? What are we learning that we'd love other people to have the chance to kind of hear about? And so they might invite a couple of speakers to talk about specific topics. So I know that that's happened for Ardent this year. There's been a lot of thought growing through what would be most helpful for our members. So some of those spots are kind of reserved for these invited speakers. But the rest of the conference is filled up by people who could be you or me. So these are usually presentations by members or for members, and they're selected from people submitting abstracts. So that's where you come in, is the rest of the spots in the conference that aren't for the invited speakers are for us to be sharing work. So reasons you might think about submitting an abstract is to get the chance to actually do that sharing of your work. I find that conferences that people often talk about where the most relevant thing that they took away from it, sometimes the most practical thing, the most useful, sometimes the most exciting part of a conference is actually hearing from people who are in similar roles to you, who have things they're doing that you could learn from. It's great because you boot the researchers off the stage and really showcase really practical kind of work. And I know, if I'm presenting to a conference with a lot of people working in services, it's interesting to them if I'm talking about services. Some of the other stuff, you can just see that it's not what people are there for. It might be harder to kind of work out how to apply that in their role. You might think about it because we want to actually showcase more local AOD work. Like I said before, there is so much incredible work happening in our sector that I think we could learn a lot from sharing more about it. It's such a collaborative, caring space that actually talking about what's happening, I think, is really useful. Why you should think about submitting for Ardent in particular is our sector is such a safe, supportive community of people that I think if it's something that you haven't done before, Ardent's a really good stepping stone into realizing that you've got something that you contribute that people can learn from. And it's such a kind community of people who just genuinely, we all care. We all just want to learn from each other. We all just want to see good work done in the territory as well. So I think Ardent's a great place to start. It's not so huge. It's not so intimidating. You probably know a lot of people in the room, and you know where they're coming from, which is a place of, really caring about us doing good work. And finally, this one's never guaranteed as well, but I've had lots of opportunities that have sprung out of that first presentation that I did. you sharing a program that you're doing. It helps let people know about that important work. Sometimes there's funding bodies, people in the room who go, actually, that's an interesting idea. And sometimes you learn, even less directly. You just learn to talk about your work and kind of boost the profile of your work in a way that can kind of help you in future attempts to kind of secure funding as well. Um, a sneaky tip is you can also submit an abstract for one conference, and then you might find another conference where you think, actually, that would be another great place for me to share that work as well. So for instance, you might submit something for Ardent and present, I'll go through the deadlines and things a little bit later, but there's national conferences like APSAD, the Australasian Professional Society for Alcohol and Drugs, where we're desperate in that to see more NT work. We barely get any abstracts from NT organisations. If you've already prepared it for this one conference, you can actually reuse that and submit for this other conference and do it in time because you've already got it ready, in time to apply for a scholarship. There's scholarships for people working in different kinds of roles as well. So you might get the opportunity to kind of present this at more than one place once you've done that work to put it together. But what even is an abstract? Like, I remember when I started this job, like, these words kind of mean nothing to you. At its core, it's just a brief snapshot of a piece of work that you've done. And what you're trying to do is communicate something that you could talk about that you think might be interesting or relevant so that the people reading it, the committee, has enough information to decide which ones they think are most relevant, most interesting to showcase them, and how they can group them together in the program. They're pretty short. So usually I know that the Ardent one is 250 to 300 words, but different conferences have different lengths. That's a pretty typical kind of length for an abstract as well. So they're sort of structured in a certain way that you get a snapshot of the whole piece of work. And I'll show you some examples in a little bit. But always check the guidelines of whatever conference you're thinking about so that you're preparing it in the correct way. Sometimes they have to reject them if it doesn't meet the sort of template that they've asked for. You don't want to sort of fall into any traps like that. So always just have a look and see what they're looking for. So looking here at the Ardent, the new abstract submission guidelines for the conference next year. So what Ardent's put together, they've said that they're going to be looking at innovation and originality, practical application of the work, and how clearly you've explained kind of the outcomes or the implications for the sector. So as I said before, 250 words, and that's for the title and the abstract as well. And they just have these limits so that they can compare apples and apples and oranges so that, someone hasn't written a page and they're trying to compare that to the level of clarity in something that is, from the guidelines. For these submission guidelines, they tell you a little bit about what the opportunity is if your abstract gets selected. So Ardent has two different presentation types that you can be selected for. There's an oral presentation that might be a 20-minute spot, so presenting original work around the conference topics, or you can also put in to say, hey, we'd actually like to do a bit of a workshop that's going to be more interactive. We want to be able to kind of do something practical with audience participation. So those are the two types that you can get. And the other tip for the abstracts is to try and write it in complete sentences so that you've not got dot points or tables or things like that in there. And the kinds of topics that we're interested in for Ardent, so there's a huge range that go across all AOD topics really. So voices of change is the theme, and we're looking to highlight sector achievements, research and innovations, and it could be around harm reduction, it could be work that you're doing in advocacy and action, it could be around evidence-based policy, people with lived and living experience perspectives or initiatives. You might be looking at criminalisation of drug use and reforms, treatment or program innovations, strengthening partnerships, connection and collaborative practice, or reducing stigma. So there's a whole range of things that are of interest because we know that all of those topics are going to be super interesting for people to watch and listen to. And as they've got there, it's great for proposals from individuals working with or identifying as part of diverse communities. So yeah, think about, you could even look to do a group presentation or a partner presentation. I've done those before as well. So there might be more than one speaker involved that you'd work with to put this together. So what makes a good abstract? So as I said before, you always check the guidelines because they're your recipe for success. With abstracts, because they're so short, I think the hardest thing, but the most important thing, is clarity. So the reader needs to be able to understand what you actually did, what you learned from that process, so that they can work out if it's going to be interesting and useful to the audience when it turns into a presentation. Use headings. Don't be afraid of headings. I know some of us, when we went to high school, we were kind of told that you're, just meant to write this big long essay. But in this world, headings are really helpful to help you kind of structure and make sure that you've got the balance of different information that you need. So different headings might work depending on what it is that you're trying to showcase. So I mentioned before, if you're doing something that's around advocacy and action, the way that you structure it and the kind of headings would be very different to, say, a research project or something that I'm presenting. So think about how to break it up. I'll give you some more examples of that as well. But do something that kind of works best for your work and your presentation, rather than trying to kind of fit it into something that's not really fit for purpose. Um, don't worry about fitting everything into the abstract. So the presentations are long enough that you're going to be able to tell people about it later. What you're doing now is just providing a taster of what they're going to get, so that the committee can make a decision around it. So I think that's the hardest part. Sometimes I'll write an abstract based on like years of work that we've done, and I think there's so much important information, I can't leave it out. But that's actually the trap, is trying to put everything in there. You just need to pick out a couple of key pieces of information. And if you have data from something that you've done, include it. It might be kind of around numbers of people who have been through a service, or it might be around people's experiences of being involved in a lived experience related advocacy initiative, whatever it might be. It's just always helpful to provide some information that helps to support what you've learned from that, that you can pass along to other people as well. So I'm going to show you a couple of different examples. These are based on APSAD, which is another big AOD conference. The reason I picked APSAD ones is because they publish them and they make them publicly available. So it means that I could kind of pick out a whole bunch and not just use mine, because a lot of mine are research based and that might not be what you're doing. So I started here with a research study for how it might actually be set up. So this one was a presentation at APSAD around drug checking, and our survey that we did with people at a music festival around their support for that as well. So you can see I've got this title up here. I've got the authors, people who have been involved in it, the actual subheadings here. So this is really standard for a research presentation, is that you've got an introduction, a method, results, discussions, and conclusions together. So I'm going to break down kind of what the recipe is in a little bit later. But essentially the introduction is really the information that I think people need to be able to understand why the topic is important in the first place, and if there's any kind of contextual things that you think that they should know. The method for a research study is around, well, what actually was the study? People need enough information to decide if they think that the data that you tell later, is it a high quality study? What is it based on? So in here, we would kind of provide things like who the actual survey participants were, what we asked them, and then kind of what analyses we did. In the results, it's really tempting when you're new to this to kind of say stuff like, people provided information about their support for drug checking. That sort of doesn't really give us enough information about what it was that you found. You're saying that you collected information about it, but it's much punchier and more compelling if you actually include that data. That's what I'm saying. So instead of me saying something like, people provided information about their support, I've actually said, this is how many people supported it, or this is what they said. If it's a qualitative study, if it's feedback from clients, you want to avoid saying something vague like clients provided feedback. you want to say something more like what the feedback actually was, is people liked this part, they weren't sure about this part, we learned X, Y, Z. Try and be specific where you can. And the discussion and conclusion is really around the so what message. So for us, in this one, we found that people generally supported drug checking. And we wanted to sort of, the so what point is that we often don't think a lot about harm reduction when you're in rural and regional areas, but we think this is really important in future. The next one that I've got here is an example. So these are some people in Sandus in SA. So this is an example of an abstract where they wanted to showcase a new initiative that they were doing. In this case, it was building a lived experience network. So similarly to my other one before, they've given a bit of background here in the introduction. So here's what they did, which was they wanted to do a project around identifying needs of people with lived experience workforce. And they thought it was useful to kind of introduce that there was this partnership here. For their method or approach, there's kind of different subheadings you can use here. That basically what they did is do a consultation, and they've told us when it actually started. In this part of it, if you're talking about a program, this is the similar part to your results basically, is like, all we're asking for here is what happened when you did the thing that you're talking about. So for here, they've described some of the outcomes of what happened when they did the network, that they've found out more about what those needs are, that it's helped them to bolster their advocacy approaches. They found it's useful for sharing information and exchanging knowledge. And there's a couple of detailed kind of things that they've added in here that they've learned. And similarly, conclusion and next steps. So what's actually happened since they did that. So it's been useful for growing their advocacy, and they're going to kind of keep doing this as part of their repertoire as long as they can continue it. This last section, implications for practice or policy, can be a good add-on if you've got the word count. Sometimes it's worth cutting down some other sections to add something here, because this really helps tell the committee what you think other people can learn from this important work that you've done as well. Another example here of more program-based work. So here they've similarly wanted to showcase a new initiative that they were doing, and they're basically describing what their service is. So this is from Each in Melbourne, and they've outlined what exactly it is. So they do alcohol, tobacco, other drug assessment, counselling, mental health screening, peer support mentoring, whole of nerve. And then in the method, this is their approach here, is what it actually is that they do in a little bit more detail. So here they've highlighted one particular project that they do, Project Hope, and what the aim of it really is. Key findings, they've discussed more about what it is that they do, so that they think this works towards reducing stigma and how it can support people to live a more meaningful and healthy life. So these kinds of ones are, I think, really great sometimes for territory projects where I know we often don't have a lot of resources to do formal evaluations. It's a big challenge in the sector, is actually being able to find the resourcing and having people on board who can help you do that. It doesn't mean that it's not still of use for us to talk about the work that we're doing. And this kind of approach is like, hey, we haven't necessarily done an evaluation of this point, but we've learned a lot from the work that we're doing. So I'm hoping we can see more of these in the NT. This one here is an example of where they actually have done a program and some evaluation. So I would say that this one probably would be even better if they included more information about what the evaluation found. But they've done a really great job of explaining the background of what this service is. So in here, Life Without Barriers is talking about their assertive outreach program pilot. Or pilot program, sorry, and where it's been funded. If I was doing this or giving some advice, I would probably say, cut one or two things out of the background here and tell us a little bit more about what you learned. But they flagged that they have done an evaluation and some important outcomes from that evaluation. So they've noted here that they found a reduction in hospital emergency room presentations and uptake of clients from people in Port Augusta. So that's still, it's a good example. Like as someone reading this, I go, oh, that's actually great. They've probably got more data that they can share in a longer presentation. So it's good if you can kind of cue people when there's more information coming as well. This one's an example of a pilot project that they've implemented in a service. So this one's around take-home naloxone dispensing and distribution and whether or not it's effective. So I know this is done kind of in partnership between researchers and people involved in the delivery of this program. So this is a bit more like a researchy kind of one, but if the project was delivered by a service, you could similarly write something like this. So they've given a bit of background, what exactly, we know that this is an important topic because opioid overdose rates have been increasing in the last decade, and they've explained why ambulances kind of need to be involved in here. An important part of this that they've got is what was the actual aim of what it is that they're trying to do. It can be really quite nice and neat to just say something like this. Here's what our aim actually was in this project that we did. Here's a good example of them giving a bit of information about what exactly the information and the learnings are based on. So they've talked about doing an online survey with some of the staff. They followed them up. They did an interview with some people as well. And you might not have fancy statistics. That just might not be what was right for the service. But even here, they've got some proportions that they've reported that they learned from doing this survey. So most participants were satisfied. They've got their 63%. Here's a good example of kind of using the data in a way that can be quite compelling. That we've actually done some good research here. We've got the feedback. If it's quantitative, using those percentages instead of just saying most people were satisfied, it gives people more insight into the work. And then, you don't usually use percentages when you're doing like feedback or qualitative work, but you can describe kind of what people told you about it. I've just got, this is my last one here. So this is an example of research done within an actual service. And I know that there are some good projects out in the NT that have had the chance to do evaluations. So this might be more similar to what you would do there. So similarly, they've said most people receiving opioid agonist treatments smoke tobacco, and the interventions for that are less effective than compared to general populations. And they're basically saying this is why we did this work here. They've talked about inviting patients from within the service who did these interviews with people and how they went about the analysis. In this particular study, they've told us a little bit about who the participants were that did this, and then they've been really specific about what the results of that actually were as well. So vaping is less stigmatizing, better tasting, and they've given enough information that I could just read this abstract alone and have learned something. I'm sure if I see the full presentation, I'll learn even more. But this is the sort of balance of giving enough information that people can see the comprehensiveness of the work as from that snapshot. So like I've said before, the key ingredients are based on those headings. So depending on what it is, what kind of work you're doing, that will determine what your headings actually are. So you're probably always going to have an introduction or a background where you're just getting people up to speed on why it's important. You'll have a method, or if you're talking about a program, some kind of heading that tells the reader that the next bit is about what we actually did and why. You'll have results, or it might be about the implementation or key findings, that kind of heading. And then again, discussion and conclusion. And if you feel like you've got some really punchy lessons that you've learned, you might have this extra thing around, well, what does it all mean? And what do we think needs to change because of this? I've already kind of gone through this. So intro, background, what do they need to know to help see why it's important? What was it that you did? What happened when you did it? And what did you learn? And what's the key takeaway message that you want a reader to kind of walk away knowing from it? Can you think of any ways that this might matter for how you do things in future or how others do things too? So don't know how people are feeling about interactive kind of approaches right now. I guess I'll see by putting it out there. But I'm interested in if anyone can kind of give me an example, it might be a real program that you're doing, or we can make one up together as well. Anyone interested in kind of putting something out there as an example, a project that you're doing, a program.
Just raise your hand and then I'll be able to unmute you or put it in the chat, and I'm happy to let Cass know.
It's all right. If there's no takers, Stephanie, I might workshop with one with you if that's all right.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, so we might start with maybe let's do one about the stories project that we've worked on a little bit together. So the stories project, I guess you'll find out about it as we go along. Feel free to add any thoughts from this on the way, Stephanie, if you have. But for this particular project, I would want to be introducing this concept that when people tell, we know that when people tell stories about their lived experience, that sometimes people prefer to do that in ways that are not written or not interviews necessarily. So I'm going to have a sentence in there that's basically about basically the reason why storytelling can be a really important part of healing for people. In this description, what I would be saying is that Menzies and Ardant worked together to collect stories from people with lived experience across the Northern Territory, and people had the opportunity to tell their story in flexible formats, whether it was through voice, through paintings, through other forms of art. At their choosing, and they were supported by a worker from Ardant and Menzies to do that. In this part, I would talk about some things that we learned from that project, that people really valued the opportunity to tell their story, and that it helped people who struggled with their words and cognition, or who were nervous to speak about their experience, to find ways that kind of worked best with their communication style and where they were at. We did find it was a bit resource intensive, so it required some support along the way. And discussion and conclusion that we think that there should be more opportunities for people who have lived experience with alcohol and drugs to engage in storytelling as parts of both research and as part of therapeutic approaches, and that further work should explore how services can be supported to allow this to happen in their services. And that, whether or not I put some of what I just said into the implications for practice or policy or discussion, you only really add that extra section if you feel like you've got more to say that wasn't really captured within it. So the way that I word some of this, when I'm writing an abstract, I start with some subheadings, and then I just kind of put a few dot points down myself so that I can work out, what is it that I actually need to say. You can tell that I hadn't thought about that one enough beforehand. So just start with some dot points on your page so that you're not trying to write it from scratch. And then you kind of, the first go that you get to write it down, you'll work out different ways of saying it or what you think is most important as you work through it from there. For the Ardant conference, the process that Ardant has set up is that you submit your abstract. You would have seen an email going around because you've seen this email. So you send your abstract into Ardant, and the deadline at this stage is the 27th of January in 2025. What happens from there is reviewers are going to assess the abstracts, and like I said, there's a couple of criteria that they're thinking most about: originality and innovation and clarity and relevance, what they think is most practically useful. The people reviewing it then kind of collate their ideas around what really stood out to them and what they think the priorities should be, and they use this to kind of make those final decisions around the program, and what formats might work best for it as well. You'll then get a notification sent to your email based on your submission. And from there, that's when you decide if you're going to accept and register for the conference. And I saw in the guidelines that Ardent is offering some discounted conference registration for people who've been accepted as speakers, which is really great to help that you actually help you to get there. It's really, it just takes practice, to be honest. I've done, I don't know, probably 80 abstracts before. And my first one and how confident I felt has just gotten so much stronger over the years, just because for me now, it's not a mysterious process anymore. Those people's names shouldn't be on the screen, sorry. Ignore those. But if you do need help and you're doing it for the first time, definitely don't think that you can't do it. Just reach out for some help. So we've got this abstract mentoring kind of system set up for the first time, so that there's people like me who can actually help you work out what to present, help you turn it into an abstract. Maybe it's turn some dot points into full sentences, and kind of provide some advice on how to do it clearly. So I've helped people working in clinical services previously to put abstracts together. It might be kind of from an idea that someone's got, and I've helped them to kind of write it up. Or it might be, you know, I've seen other people say, hey, we've got this whole report, we want to do something about this, but how do we cut that down to 250 words? So there's people out here, if you contact Ardent, we're happy to help you kind of put that together.